single most important fact of the first 50 years of the 20th century, future historians will note, is that Americans speak English. And the most important fact of the last 50 years may prove to be that the Russians are white. Now that's a form of reductionism, but it's something that launches us on the question of is England as dead as she's supposed to be? Is she?
Well, I've said in the book not, because just as people were beginning to write the old country off, and as even Churchill was admitting defeat, which is what he did at his famous appearance at Fulton in 1946.
His last major speech.
His last major speech, in effect, was he said, you know, we're through, we've borne the heat and burden of the day, the torch has to be passed, but fortunately we have our American cousin. And the British spirit, as it were, must enter this new and young and vigorous body, and that will give us a further say and a further lease on life. And the first stage in doing that, really, of course, was what someone well known to you, James Burnham, called the receivership into which the United States took the British Empire. If you look at where American foreign policy is now concentrated, from Pakistan to Palestine and so on, it's an inheritance from the British Empire. And the other is obviously cultural. One of my favorite examples is to say to people, well, is George Wallace a WASP? And people say, not really, no, he seems rather a vulgar chap and so on. But I say, but he's very white, extremely Anglo-Saxon, very Protestant were the things about George Wallace. You say, is William Buckley a WASP? They say, absolutely, he's what's meant by WASP. And I say, well, white enough, but in fact Irish and Catholic in provenance. So WASP is a term of class as well as of ethnicity in America, and that's impossible to understand unless you understand the special way in which America is appealed to by the British imagination.
Cynically or non-cynically?
I would say genuinely. Both. I would say genuinely that there is a real affection that's based on a common sacrifice in war, on blood, on language, on literature, and so on. And there are certain kinds of emulation which I attack in the book. I think a rather pathetic sort of showbiz attitude to the British royal family, for example. And in politics, too easy a resort to things like Kipling and Churchill and the windier aspects of British imperial bluster when some piece of American foolishness needs to be defended overseas. It's too easy to reach for this sort of stock of metaphors. O'Sullivan and his newspapers that do it all the time. They say, this is Munich, you know, if we don't take our stand here, America will be dragged in the mire. They appeal to the Churchillian, the John Bull spirit.
So we vanquish the Falkland Islands.
Well, exactly, and the Malvinas go down and so forth. And this is testimony to an extraordinary durability of English imagery and culture in America, even though it's been mutated in this slightly suspect way. Sorry for such a long burn.
Bill, as you read the kids who were in the street protesting, how much of it was relatively sophisticated ideology? They weren't just rejecting the straight-laced lives of their parents, but the whole notion, the whole Cold War notion that communism was bad, we were good. And how much of it was just kind of naivete, romanticization of the commies, and so on?
Well, you've asked the hard questions. I mean, the fact is that there was a kind of a listlessness in the 60s, and that listlessness called for a kind of a masturbatory relief. People wanted to find if they could go ahead and get their kicks in some way that they hadn't been getting them, and the more so if they could wed them to some ideal. In fact, what it was primarily self-concern and an attempt to cast a noble perspective on what it is that you were up to.
You were engaged in narcissism,
I think
Christopher?
I'll have to quarrel literally as well as metaphorically with Mr. Buckley's characterization of it as masturbatory. Actually, it was quite celebrated for going the distance. Perhaps one of the great things about it was that it was the first generation, or perhaps one of the less great things about it, but at any rate one of the true things about it, one of the first generations to take the separation of sex and procreation for granted, which I think led to a great deal of jealousy, incidentally, not to say envy, among preceding generations.
The pill came into wide use just about then.
I think it might be worth making a distinction between being, as it were, a 68er or soixante huitard, as the more pretentious of us call ourselves, and a 60s person, because anyone born in the right boom bracket can claim to have been a 60s person. And the way it's all represented now retrospectively, airbrushed and rewritten, is beads, caftans, exactly as Mr. Buckley says, make love, not war, Woodstock Nation, all that. Now that was sort of common generationally, as common as, say, James Dean had been a bit earlier. But what we're talking about, I believe, is the 60s left. In other words, the attempt to block what we thought of, correctly in my view still, as an imperialist and aggressive and unjust war.
We had our burdens during the 19th century, we British, and during the first part of this century, our fleet tranquilized the world. We don't have it anymore. We were exhausted by the Second World War, plus the impulse to separatism, which I declined explicitly to endorse. You've got to take over in this sense, but you don't say it in those words because it sounds like too much self-abnegation, and politically it's impossible to say. Is that not a fair reading of what he was saying in that first half?
I would say it was, and in the same way as, for example, Kipling's most famous poem, about which I have a chapter, is called The White Man's Burden. It's one of the few lines of Kipling everybody knows, take up the white man's burden. Now, people I've found are surprised to find Kipling wrote that poem directly as an address to the United States. But it's obvious from the line, because you wouldn't talk to the country that already had the white man's burden, namely Britain, and tell it to take it up. What in fact is being said by Kipling to the United States is take over the white man's burden. It's made very clear.
To endorse, you've got to take over in this sense. But you don't say it in those words because it sounds like too much self-abnegation, and politically it's impossible to say. Is that not a fair reading of what he was saying in that first half?
I would say it was, and in the same way as, for example, Kipling's most famous poem, about which I have a chapter, is called The White Man's Burden. It's one of the few lines of Kipling everybody knows, take up the white man's burden. Now, people I've found are surprised to find Kipling wrote that poem directly as an address to the United States. But it's obvious from the line, because you wouldn't talk to the country that already had the white man's burden, namely Britain, and tell it to take it up. What in fact is being said by Kipling to the United States is take over the white man's burden. It's made very clear. And it was addressed to Congress in the hope that Congress would annex the Philippines, which it did.
But when Kipling wrote those lines, the historical perspective of, say, 150 or 200 years justified what you now, I think, consigned as an act of condescension. Whatever was going on in India, which nobody I know of defends, even you, stopped going on when the white men said, don't do that. Don't make widows burn themselves on the pile of their husbands.
Marx himself said that the British influence on India was, in some extent and degree, a civilizing influence, that it broke up the caste system and millennial slavery, yes.
Why do you say Marx himself? I don't understand. Why do you say Marx himself?
Well, it's not expected of Marx that he would have defended the British putting down the Indian Mutiny, but he did do so. So, I mean, on the argument of evidence against presumed interest, it's more to be remarked upon than other cases. But Kipling, I think, you see, was much more far-sighted than people give him credit for. He could see the exhaustion of that coming
This didn't get in the way of Marx's proletariat thing. He wasn't talking about the proletariat being put down.
No, by no means.
So therefore, it oughtn't to have surprised you that Marx would have made that comment.
It doesn't surprise me, I guess.
The war in Vietnam. You oppose it on moral and ideological grounds as aggressive and imperialist.
Yes.
Now, so my question is, you really believed that? You thought that the United States was the United States was the offending party?
I would affirm it now. In fact, with greater knowledge and infinitely larger depth of evidence to draw upon, yes.
That the Chinese, the Soviets supplying the North Vietnamese were the good guys in this one?
I think the hardest thing probably to get people to remember now, even though they must remember it at the time, or should, is that the official reason given for intervention in Vietnam, well, there were several, and they kept changing, but one of them was that it was to stop Chinese expansionism into the Indo-Chinese Peninsula. That's now considered so ridiculous, and it's so self-evidently untrue, that it's hard to remember that that was one of the official alibis.
Are you saying that it was untrue and known to be untrue at the time?
Well, whether or not Mr. Rusk, say, believed that a South Vietnamese post-French colonial buffer state, guaranteed and underwritten by the US, was an insurance against Chinese expansionism or not, I don't know. But I do know that that's what he maintained. It seems fantastic, doesn't it? Kind of call, or haven't until recently. No one in America sort of wants to borrow anything like the British National Health Service, for example, either, which would be another excellent bit of emulation. Instead, what you tend to get is what I got yesterday, actually, when by chance I had to call an emergency room in a hospital. And before I could blurt out why I needed one, the woman said, "Where are you from? I just love your accent. It's real neat. Why don't you just keep talking?" And I said, "Well, madam, I know we have a reputation for politeness, but I must insist on." This happens to me a lot. And what it is actually is a kind of snobbery, a sort of inferiority complex. Why can't I go into a supermarket without seeing a picture of Princess Diana, who I left England to get away from?
But then this cultural thing works in reverse as well, doesn't it? For
Well,
example,
when I go, exactly, you see, the same. If I go back to England, what do I get? McDonald's hamburgers and American nuclear bases. So
Well,
it seems to me there's something in the relationship that tends to reinforce the conservative and the commercial and the, what shall we say?
Excuse me,
You delight in saying the reaction.
I think it's odd to want to get away from Princess Diana.
You do?
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, if she were frumpy, frowsy, and banal,
well then,
you might want
let
to
me
get
put it
away
like this.
from
I'd
her.
like to do the same thing as I suspect she'd like to do and get away at least from her husband. In other words, from the popular celebration of the House of Windsor, I could do with the rest from that, and I thought I could get it in the country of George Washington, which went to all this trouble not just to expel the monarchy, but to make sure it could never come back.
But the godfather of that impulse was containment. The doctrine of containment had been around since 1945, 46. Czechoslovakia had provoked a reinvigoration of it, i.e. they must go no further. And behind that impulse is, to be sure, a perfectly raw colonialism, which is everywhere displayed, but also the threat of China doing what they did in Korea 10 years earlier.
On this containment question,
Yes.
as well as containment, in other words, the reaction to the Stalinization of Eastern Europe, there was also something that had been going on during and after the Second World War, namely and unnoticed because it could be assimilated under the rubric of containment or anti-communism, which was the United States becoming, without a vote or really much of a debate on the subject, the successor state to the former European empires. Okay, to the British in part of the Mediterranean and the Middle East, especially after Suez in '56, to the French in Indochina, which is my main point.
You're not going to let him get away with calling us an empire,
but
are
also
you?
to the Portuguese.
I'll flip this one to you in a moment. Go
to
ahead.
the French in and the Belgians in the Congo, to the French and Portuguese, and even in the Dutch in Indonesia. Remember the coup in Indonesia in '65. Now, the origin of what some have called the morass or quagmire in Vietnam is the decision by Eisenhower and Dulles to inherit French colonial rule in Vietnam. That's really the situation. The United States put itself in the position of being a classical colonial imperial power. I don't myself believe that they had a prayer of reversing that verdict by continuing to bomb and destroy more of Vietnam than they actually did. And remember, they covered it pretty much from end to end. I don't think we really say there wasn't enough violence used on the Vietnamese, can you?
Well,
it was suggested to President Eisenhower that we intervene to prevent Dien Bien Phu, and he said no. So in that sense, he said French colonialism has to look after itself. But looking after itself is different from being colonized by another entity, to wit, a Soviet entity, against which we were globally engaged. And it mattered enormously when looking down on the old Vietnam, it appeared that Vietnam, the North, was to be the aggressor to the South, threatening all that lay in the West.
They came without being
You're speaking awfully fast. I don't always follow you. Are you suggesting that there's something surreptitious about the existence of nuclear bases in Great Britain?
In the book, I quote the then Secretary of Defense, Forrestal, who, as you know, came to a sticky end, but was then in a lucid interval, who said, as far as he knew, there had never before been an agreement whereby one power stationed its forces on the territory of another without a treaty, without any formal written understanding of any kind. Many smaller and weaker countries, such as the Philippines, have a ratified, renewable agreement that the United Kingdom just doesn't have. This testifies, in my view, to the latent strength of the special relationship. People don't think of Americans as foreign.
Forrestal died in '46. He was a lawyer, an international lawyer, as a specialist, and for him to say this is the first time that something has happened does not suggest that it's outrageous.
By no means. Not of itself, no.
The firebombing of Dresden had never happened before, and it was also outrageous. But the evolution of NATO is not something that suggests, other than that, England, as a partner to NATO, would have carried its share of the responsibility to make NATO effective. It seems to me that in your book you attach a kind of importance to that isn't earned, that I can see.
Well, if I don't carry the point in that way, I don't know if I'll be able to convince you now. I think there is a difference, though, and I make it by contrast with de Gaulle, who once asked the commander of American forces in his country.
You like that, yeah?
Yeah, can you tell me how many American nuclear weapons there are in France? So the guy said, I can, but I'm not allowed to. You're not allowed to know that. And de Gaulle said, well, all right, but no French president will ever be talked to in those terms ever again. And meant it, without removing France from the West. He said, no, there are certain decisions we will not find out have been taken for us.
Closing questions on Vietnam. Do you wish, from this vantage point, that we had simply never gone in?
Yes.
You do. Christopher, let me ask you what you wish. Between the fall of Vietnam and the fall of the Berlin Wall, I counted them up, and there are at least 9 countries, at least 9, that fell under Soviet domination. Do you feel, as a coffee planter in Cuba and a Trotskyite, any responsibility for the period of misery those people, the people of those countries, endured?
Any personal responsibility?
Yes, actually, any personal responsibility. You and the generation of '68, the protesters.
I really think it would be grandiose of me to accept any,
but
but I also think...
All right, symbolic.
Morally, no, of course I don't, because I was and
you were right then.
I always was a vocal opponent of that, and I consider the revolution of 1989...
Vocal opponent of what? Of the Soviet Union?
Yes.
What do you regret that you did? Let me ask that. What do you regret that you did in the 60s?
I think that I regret there was a slogan that was painted on the walls of Paris at one point in the great upheaval of May '68, which said, "Take your desires for reality." I think there was a certain hedonistic utopianism around, which, though I tried to...
You grant Bill's point about the self-indulgence.
Oh, I thought I did so except by substituting fornication for masturbation. Thought I'd already clarified that.
All right, fine.
Saying no, it was going all the way. It wasn't onanism.
And what do you regret that you did?
Well, I regret that I didn't, sooner than we did, come forward with a countdown on the Vietnam War. We were always being told in 1968, 69, 70, victory's around the corner. And they tend to say that persuasively. A lot of people were persuaded. I went to Vietnam 3 times and wrote back that it looked good. I was told it looked good.
You regret trusting the government of the United States?
Well, it's not so much the government I trust. It is individual people working their own perspectives. Now, you can call that government if indeed you say, well, he works for the government. But I saw them, and I thought I saw them making individual... I spent a night in a bunker with General Abrams, and he wasn't giving me 2.5 hours talk for the sake of confusing me. This is what he thought. And I haven't seen an awful lot of people, McNamara is the great exception, who've gone around saying during that whole time, we were simply feeding American journalists and American surveyors stuff we knew wasn't true.
I think it's greatly to the credit of the United States that the government felt it had to lie to the people about this war from the beginning. My main regret is I didn't do more than I did to help the anti-war movement. It's still, what little I did do is still a great cause of pride to me, but I think, and I'm not searching for common ground in saying this, believe me, but I should have thought that one thing we do perhaps share is a feeling that widespread distrust in the government isn't a bad thing. The fact that there was great disillusionment at that point may have struck you then as being a defeat, but surely, from a conservative point of view, there must have been something salutary about it.
I keep saying...
The presumption is that the state is in the business of aggrandizing its power and ought to be watched. But the presumption taken to a certain point blinds you if, in fact, you simply refuse to listen to what is being said and then make your own evaluation. Barry Goldwater went over there. I saw him the day back. He came back. He's a pretty experienced fellow. And he thought, this was 1967, he thought that the enemy couldn't continue to sustain the casualties it did. Now, that's a reasonable thing to say. You might have been said that, don't be said, there will never be any lack of people who will rise up and volunteer to commit suicide on behalf of a free Vietnam. You'd have been right, but it would have been
swarming of the English, as Woodrow Wilson called it in his history. and the presence of Englishmen in America. But the reason why that
and
is,
their dominance.
the reason why that seems so imbricated, so natural to the whole texture of the thing, is therefore what I mean by the blood and nostalgia bit, if not the class.
Not just, of course, the English. The Scots-Irish, the Ulstermen, were a major part of the early settlement. But again, people don't regard them as a separate group. They often describe themselves as Irish. I believe they're 57% of those who describe themselves as Irish in America. But they're not Irish
we're
in the...
Protestants.
Yes, that's right, and from Ulster. But they're not part of the Irish in the sense that they have this strong sentimental connection to Ireland, which is sometimes expressed in sympathy for Irish republicanism.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Christopher Hitchens, author of Blood, Class, and Nostalgia, which you are authorized by by my confederate here to read, provided you mix it up with a few other books. Is that right? Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Right.